Hi, I'm Zack Walsh, a Ph.D. candidate at Claremont School of Theology and a research specialist at Toward Ecological Civilization, the Institute for the Postmodern Development of China, and the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, Germany. I'm sorry I can't be there with you today, but I'd like to thank the conference organizers and especially Laszlo for allowing me to contribute this video lecture. Over the next 20 minutes, I'll be giving a critical and constructive reflection on mindfulness trends and their potential for addressing social and ecological issues. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have a good rest of your conference. Millions of people are receiving tangible benefits from their mindfulness practice. Less stress, better concentration, perhaps a little more empathy. Almost daily, the media cites scientific studies that report the numerous health benefits of mindfulness meditation and how such a simple practice can affect neurological changes in the brain. Needless to say, this is an important development to be welcomed. But is something missing in the midst of all the media hype? Most scientific and popular accounts circulating in the media have portrayed mindfulness in terms of stress reduction and attention enhancement. These human performance benefits are heralded as the sine qua non of mindfulness, and its major attraction for modern corporations. A common misconception is that mindfulness meditation is a private, internal affair. Mindfulness is often marketed as a method for personal self-fulfillment, a reprieve from the trials and tribulations of cutthroat corporate life. Though such an individualistic and consumer orientation to the practice of mindfulness may be effective for self-preservation and self-advancement, it is essentially impotent for mitigating the causes of collective and organizational distress. Thus far, those celebrating the mindfulness boom have avoided any serious consideration of why stress is so pervasive in corporations and society. According to New York Times business reporter David Gels, author of Mindful Work, stress isn't something imposed on us, it's something we impose on ourselves. Stress and misery are partly due to our habitual reactivity, but Gels is too reductionist in his advice. His victim-blaming philosophy echoes the corporate mindfulness ethos. Shift the burden and locus of psychological stress and structural insecurities onto the individual employee, frame stress as a personal problem, and then offer mindfulness as the panacea. Critical psychologist David Smale referred to this philosophy as magical voluntarism, because it blames individuals for their own stress, ignoring the social and economic conditions that may have contributed to it. In this way, mindfulness enables and extends neoliberal governmentality through practices of responsibilization, which refers to the process whereby subjects are rendered individually responsible for a task which previously would have been the duty of another, usually a state agency, or would not have been recognized as a responsibility at all. When mindfulness is practiced in this way, there is a dissociation between one's own personal transformation and the kind of organizational transformation that takes into account the causes and conditions of suffering in the broader environment. Such a colonization of mindfulness also has an instrumentalizing effect, reorienting the practice to the needs of the market, rather than a critical reflection on ultimate concerns, ethics, and human values. The mindfulness movement, however, need not follow the usual trajectory of most corporate fads: unbridled enthusiasm, uncritical acceptance of the status quo, and eventual disillusionment. Fortunately, there have been an increasing number of scholars from the humanities and social sciences critically examining how mindfulness can be more than a private self-help technique. They began asking critical questions such as, what is mindfulness for? Are mindfulness-based interventions limited to a palliative for individual stress relief and mental hygiene? Or can mindfulness programs develop in ways that call into question deeply rooted cultural assumptions, which have been the source of so much misery, injustice, and unnecessary suffering in the modern world? At a time when the hype, commercialization, and popularity of mindfulness is at its peak, leaders should be cautious and discerning. Leaders must be wary of decontextualized treatments of mindfulness and encourage dialogue that will take into account historical, cultural, social, political, economic, racial, and ethical dimensions of contemplative practice. Leaders must also appreciate how everyone is implicated in the cultural translation of mindfulness, and why we all share an ethical responsibility to question the values instantiated in particular mindfulness practices. In the next section, I provide a number of guidelines for developing an ethically informed mindfulness practice, as well as principles for advancing a more socially engaged approach to mindfulness training in organizations. These are the 10 guidelines for leading ethically informed mindfulness programs. Starting with number 1, mindfulness must be coupled with clear comprehension. Contrary to popular definitions, mindfulness is not merely paying attention to the present moment non-judgmentally. Discrimination, evaluation, and judgment are part and parcel of mindfulness. Clear comprehension has a reflexive monitoring quality. What seems self-evident often remains distorted by implicit biases. But when clear comprehension and mindfulness are cultivated together, leaders can fully grasp and comprehend what is actually taking place in one's own mind and surroundings. Developing clear comprehension involves more than simply paying attention to the breath or concentrating one pointedly on an object. Clear comprehension can range from basic forms of knowing to discriminative understanding, the latter of which is able to discern wholesome from unwholesome thoughts and behaviors. Number 2. Corporate mindfulness programs must diagnose and address the causes of workplace stressors. The scientific research on mindfulness has already well established the potential health benefits of mindfulness for individuals. Because the majority of mindfulness programs are designed for individual-level stress reduction and therapeutic relief, these individual-focused programs will not effectively address the structural and systemic sources of stress. Individualized mindfulness programs are not designed to take into account how stress is shaped by a complex set of interacting power relations, networks of interests, and narratives. Systemic and structural problems cannot be solved at the individual level of personal well-being. Rather, they require collective discerning attention and action that connects the work of self-care with social and political engagement. Number 3. Mindfulness is not a value-free practice. Mindfulness is often thought to be a value-free practice, stripped of its religious trappings and validated by science. The secular status of mindfulness often prohibits an open discussion of ethics. Those who simultaneously claim that mindfulness is value-free and universally beneficial escape scrutiny by preventing any critical investigation of who benefits from mindfulness, how, and why. Taking a depoliticized view of mindfulness conveniently forecloses critical inquiry pertaining to the social, economic, and political interests linked to such programs. While mindfulness programs may provide salutary health benefits to individual employees, which we applaud, such programs are also training and conditioning individual employees to see themselves as completely autonomous, fully responsible, and self-regulating employees who can govern themselves. Number 4. Mindfulness is more than a technique. Unfortunately, the stripping away of mindfulness from its ethical context, whether explicitly or implicitly, comes at a cost. Uncoupling mindfulness from its ethical roots is myopic, promoting an overemphasis on technique. Driscoll and Webb have aptly termed this trend as technical spirituality, where spiritual practices are extracted from their ethical context to be used as tools for improving efficiency, productivity, and gaining tangible results. Strong institutional structures and market pressures have the capacity to co-opt and appropriate mindfulness to their own ends. The rush to dissociate mindfulness from its ethical roots and context is not necessary in order to be palpable and acceptable to our modern sensibilities. But ensuring the ethical efficacy of mindfulness requires a willingness to view it not as simply a technique for therapeutic self-help and productivity improvement. Number 5. The purpose and quality of mindfulness is context-dependent. There is a widespread misconception that mindfulness is a universal, ahistorical, and context-free practice, since what is being taught is allegedly the pure essence of what was once a religious practice. This appeal to universalism isn't just a matter of decontextualizing and purging meditative practices from their cultural context and religious roots, but also of recontextualizing them into the sensibilities of modernity and Western consumer capitalism. For several decades, mindfulness-based interventions and courses were situated in clinics and hospitals, in medical and therapeutic contexts. The medicalization of mindfulness draws from a biomedical paradigm, where stress is understood and theorized as an individual pathology. Importing a medicalized view of mindfulness into organizations disavows them from any responsibility in addressing the social, cultural, and economic factors of workplace stress. Nevertheless, context matters. Mindfulness is embedded within a complex web of interdependencies, conceptual systems, aesthetic factors, social settings, motivations and aspirations, emotional factors, individual differences, and temporal contexts. Number 6. Beware of the commodification of mindfulness programs. The booming popularity of mindfulness movement has also turned it into a lucrative cottage industry. And it's no surprise that corporate mindfulness programs command premium consulting fees. Prominent corporate mindfulness consultants have been known to charge $12,000 a day. Google's Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute charges $8,000 a day minimum for its training. Clearly, corporate mindfulness trainers have a great deal to gain financially from marketing such programs as being universally beneficial and profitable to their corporate sponsors. Conflicts of interest are a matter that is almost never raised or discussed in these circles. But can we really rely on personal testimonies that we need not worry or be concerned about issues raised by skeptics or critics, when these assurances are given by trainers, consultants, and teachers who have a significant financial stake in selling and sustaining their corporate mindfulness training programs? Number 7. Introducing mindfulness requires full disclosure. Leading corporate mindfulness teachers often declare to their corporate sponsors, especially when trying to sell a program, that mindfulness practices have nothing to do with Buddhism. But backstage, at conferences, and in social media, these same corporate mindfulness teachers wax poetic about how they are teaching the Buddha Dharma. However, deceit is contrary to the ethics of honest speech and truthfulness, factors upon which mindfulness depends. Leaders have an ethical obligation to fully disclose that the majority of mindfulness practices being taught today are adapted from Buddhist sources. Participants in such programs should also give informed consent and have a choice for opting out. Number 8. Don't overpromise or oversell mindfulness programs. Most corporate mindfulness consultants are overselling the benefits of individualized mindfulness training. Going beyond individual-level health benefits, proponents are promising that mindfulness can act as a disruptive technology, reforming even the most dysfunctional corporations into kinder, more compassionate, and sustainable organizations. It remains an open question whether training individuals in mindfulness will transform corporations and society, or whether it merely amounts to an individual-level employee stress reduction and a form of corporate quietism. This open question of what mindfulness may or may not lead to is really the rub of the matter, which asks that all parties invested in mindfulness collectively inquire into the multifarious forces of altruism and exploitation that might occur in organizations. Number 9. Corporate mindfulness programs must face the question of ethics. Many mindfulness teachers have argued that any single set of ethics would be an inappropriate imposition. Instead, ethical concerns are reduced to being contingent on the integrity of the mindfulness teacher, who serves as a model and embodiment of ethical behavior. This not only reflects the values of individualism in the mindfulness movement, but it also takes a laissez-faire, let-the-market-decide attitude. Absent an ethical vision to guide mindfulness practice, its potential will be limited to therapeutic aims and self-improvement, without issuing any challenge to one's beliefs, values, and way of life. The legacy of our Judeo-Christian heritage, where ethics is conceived in terms of prescriptions, duties, edicts, and coercive moral shoulds, is also not appropriate for secular mindfulness programs. However, rather than simply eschewing ethical principles, or imposing Buddhist ethics through distorted Western lenses, my colleagues and I propose that leaders explore adopting a non-normative ethical orientation that may be expansive and flexible enough to serve as a guiding ethos for what we propose as the twofold tasks of the critique of mindfulness and the mindfulness of critique. Number 10. Mindfulness needs to move beyond the rhetoric of stress reduction, well-being, and happiness. In outlining these points, we are taking a step back to summarize some of the outstanding issues that the mainstream mindfulness movement largely continues to ignore. At the same time, we are laying the groundwork for charting a new course. The critique of mindfulness is part of a larger movement to build new approaches to socially engaged mindfulness interventions as a corrective and supplement to the individualistic and therapeutic focus of prevailing approaches. The critique of mindfulness is thus twinned with the reciprocal task of the mindfulness of critique, which is the work of attuning ourselves with new modes of learning, inquiry, and social engagement, so that we may become more responsive towards the challenges and conditionings entangling the well-being of individuals and the messy worlds we inhabit. Given the limitations of the prevailing rhetoric of non-judgmental awareness and focus on happiness or stress reduction, we offer the guiding rubric of refuge as a countervailing alternative to help cultivate the mindfulness of critique. The promise of refuge is a starting premise of Buddhism, but the metaphor and ideal of refuge can be found in different religious and even non-religious lineages of understanding. The metaphorical import of refuge for a secular world can be extended to a non-doctrinal and non-sectarian principle of responsive responsibility and responsible responsiveness, which entangles the self with others and the world. We propose that ethical leadership entails the work of making refuge, beginning with the promise that all of us, human and non-humans, must invite from and give to one another mutual recognition, respect, care, and concern in order to grow and thrive in a precarious world, where vulnerability to conditions beyond our choosing is a fact of life. Unlike the metaphors of happiness, well-being, and efficiency, which bind mindfulness to the neoliberal subject, practicing mindfulness as an act of making refuge opens up space for recognizing people's vulnerability, our mutual dependency, and our ability to face an uncertain future in solidarity with one another. Whereas mindfulness for stress reduction retroactively rationalizes our present situation by treating the symptoms rather than the causes and conditionings of our suffering, socially engaged mindfulness interventions are oriented toward a collective future of liberation, never fully realized but nevertheless expressed in our commitment to each other. We are developing these ideas for a contemplative workshop entitled Socially Engaged Mindfulness Interventions in the Promise of Making Refuge, to be held July 28th through 30th in Berkeley, California. The workshop will run under the Mind and Life Institute's think tank program, with the co-support of grant funding from the Lens Foundation. The structure and scope of the workshop will be developed in conversation with a core group of participants, including Buddhist Eco-Dharma teacher and author David Loy, Professor of Law and Educator of Color Insight Practices Rhonda McGee, Professor of American Studies and Buddhist Peace Fellowship Board member Funi Shu, and Buddhist teacher and social activist educator Mushima Akeda. Together, the organizing team and invited participants share differing levels of expertise in the areas of critical pedagogy and liberal arts education, ecological activism and sustainable living, and minority rights and struggles. Together, we are interested in engaging different modes of inquiry, such as Buddhist critical constructive reflection and critical mindfulness studies. feminist posthumanist scholarship, process and political ecology, and the commons. We are also interested in engaging people beyond the academy, like community organizers, activists, and members of diverse sanghas, who understand the intersectionality of race, gender, and class oppression in the context of ongoing social ecological crises. We are curious what contemplation looks like in conversation with radical knowledge practices, and we would like to invite anyone who shares our interests and concerns to join us. For more information, please see the text below this video to find links to our project webpage, citations, and social media pages. Finally, thank you for listening to this lecture.